How badly will a new antitrust ruling hurt Google? Will new competitors emerge to challenge the search giant? That's coming up today on Business Matters. Good afternoon, and thank you so much for being here with me today. I'm your host, Don Ma. Starting with markets, clawing back some of yesterday's losses today. The Dow snapping a three-day losing streak and adding over 300 points. S&P 500 up over 1%, closing above 5,200, and the Nasdaq also up just over 1% today. So markets still relatively volatile today, but at least ending in positive territory. Yesterday, we saw a major drop in Japanese equities spilled over into U.S. markets, where the Nasdaq was down over 6% at one point. So big banks are suggesting that we may not be completely over this volatility and risk just yet. We'll have more on that later in the show. But let's get to today's big winners. Uber, Palantir, Kenvue, all up over 10%. More info on that in just a moment. But first, Taco Bell, parent company Yum Brands, rising 2.5% despite a larger than expected fall in sales. Weak demand at KFC and boycotts related to the Middle East conflict have reached other markets. Those dips were offset by Taco Bell's strong demand across income groups and cost controls. So a little boost for Holiday Inn owner Intercontinental Hotels Group, up about 0.1%. IHG reported a pattern shift, if you will, this year, with domestic tourism in China shifting to overseas travel to other Asia-Pacific countries. So the hospitality provider said a weakness in China was offset by a robust rebound in the U.S. And Palantir rallying over 10% today after a strong earnings report. The artificial intelligence software company boosting its full-year forecast. And this comes after the company posted $678 million in revenue for the second quarter between its commercial and government sectors. That's up 27% from a year before. And Uber shares popping today, up almost 11%. So the ride-hailing company reporting a strong second quarter, ride volume and value surging as well. Here's the details on that.
Uber stock jumps after a strong second quarter. Gross bookings, or the total value of rides, deliveries, and freight, up 21% year over year at nearly $40 billion. Uber's adjusted earnings before interest, taxes, depreciation, and amortization up 71% year over year. The company expects gross bookings to exceed $40 billion in the next quarter. CEO Dara Khosrowshahi said during the earnings call their consumers are in great shape.
Our audience is bigger than ever and using our services more frequently than ever. While our consumers tend to be higher income, we're not seeing any softness or trading down across any income cohort.
Khosrowshahi said many people are getting into the habit of ordering food. The number of first-time Uber Eats users was at its highest in the U.S. than at any point in the past 5 quarters. People with an Uber One membership made up half of delivery gross bookings. From an earlier investor update, Khosrowshahi said these people are a major revenue driver.
About a third of our consumers buy multiple products or use multiple products on our service. They spent 3.4 times more. That's increased from 25%. So it's been a pretty significant increase.
Gross bookings from deliveries were up 17% year over year, and gross bookings from rides were up 27%.
They're using AI very well. So there is no wastage. There is no leakage in the system. The drivers are not waiting around too long. And you get a car immediately.
Financial analyst Santosh Rao says Uber has a better way of predicting and allocating demand because of artificial intelligence. Uber is investing in AI as well as other future technologies such as electric and autonomous vehicles. Partnering with Chinese electric vehicle maker BYD is one step in that direction.
The electrification of our fleet is an incredibly important initiative for us. If you look at Uber drivers are switching over to electric at 5 times kind of the speed that normal drivers are.
Khosrow Shahi says 100,000 new BYD vehicles will enter the Uber platform. He says he chose BYD because of affordability, the number one problem drivers have. The partnership also involves autonomous vehicles, which he says are a big part of the future. His strategy is to be a key partner for autonomous vehicle makers instead of building the cars themselves.
And let's talk about this today. Google may be the one who lost an antitrust lawsuit, but Apple is likely going to take a hit too, potentially. So a federal judge ruled that Google paying companies to make its search engine the default browser violates U.S. antitrust law. For 2 decades, Google has paid Apple a chunk of its search revenue made on Apple devices. Court documents estimated that number to be around $20 billion in 2022. Google may have to scrap that deal with Apple. And joining us now is Carl Szabo. He's the Vice President for NetChoice and Professor of Internet Law at George Mason University. Now, Carl, I want to focus today's conversation not on the merit of the ruling, but if the ruling were to be enforced, for example, can you tell us what would Google be forced to do to change if this ruling is enforced?
Yeah, thanks for having me on. That's one of the big questions that's still unknown. Today's ruling was merely on the merits, not the outcome. So basically, the judge said, yes, Google violated antitrust law, which I disagree with, but we'll figure out exactly how to remedy the situation at a further point. So the next step in this proceeding is exactly that question. What are the remedies? Now, it could be as simple as Google is forbidden from entering into agreements to make its search engine the default on platforms. So right now, Google pays Apple about $20 billion a year to be the default search engine. What it might end up happening is Apple decides, well, if we still want to have the best product out there with the best search engine, we'll keep Google. Otherwise, it opens the door for other companies to try and fight for that space. The second thing is, and a more extreme remedy, would be to try and literally break apart Google, break apart search, break apart ads, break apart YouTube, break apart chat or Gmail. And what that ultimately means is the wonderful integration that Google relies on, that we as consumers rely on, might be lost as well. So this is a big question, and that will really inflame how this gets taken up on appeal, because if it's an extreme remedy, the appeal is much more likely to win.
All right, can you explain to us if you see any potential here of this ruling, and the remedies, of course, change our way of experiencing the internet?
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the main things that we kind of enjoy is the ability for us to seamlessly move from one site to another to browse independently. So one of the main complaints against Google search is that it's so good at giving you the results that you don't need to visit underlying websites. So if I were to do something as simple as what is the weather, it would tell me that it's 90 degrees, that it's sunny, without instead sending me, well, here's a link to weather.com. And now you can go and type in the information there and your address there and your location there, and then we'll give you the weather. And that's the type of enjoyment, that's the type of functionality that might be lost if the judge says Google can't do that anymore. It can't put its own services, such as what is the weather, front and center, and instead just returns me to the Google of 20 years ago, where it's just a bunch of links and no real answers that I seek.
Can you talk a little bit as well as to whether this is going to impact Apple? Because Google has been paying Apple billions, right?
Yeah, so right now, Google allegedly pays Apple about $20 billion a year to be the default search engine. That's kind of like when you walk into the supermarket and you see a product at the end of the aisle, those companies pay for that premier placement. Google's doing the same thing with Apple. But the $20 billion and Google has never been the main factor here. It's the quality of the search engine. Google's biggest competitor on search is Bing, which is a Microsoft product. Microsoft is the largest corporation on the planet. And at any day, at any time, Microsoft could essentially bet a dump truck full of money up to Apple and try to buy its way into being the default. Apple hasn't chosen that. And that's because it seems Apple wants good search engine. So the impact to Apple might be a loss of $20 billion a year, but I don't see them abandoning what is the premier benefit of Apple, which is it just works. It gives you exactly what you want when you want it. And so by abandoning Google and its search quality, Apple might actually lose that prestige.
Okay, just 30 seconds here. Any monetary impact on Google's business?
Oh, absolutely. If this gets broken apart, I mean, that's incredible impact. But it's not just Google. This is part of a broader attack on business. There are no consumer harms that are occurring from Google. All it is corporations like Yelp or Microsoft are the ones that aren't being benefited. They are the big winners in this decision. American consumers are not. And this is a broad shot against the entire business community, whether you're Google, NVIDIA, or in simply Albertsons supermarkets. The government is coming for you.
All right. Okay, Carl, thanks again for coming on the show today.
Thank you.
All right, moving on. So we've been covering how the unwinding of a popular trade has rippled through global markets. So JP Morgan and UBS saying today that the unwind is only 50% done. So I'm referring to the carry trade, of course. For years, investors around the world have been taking advantage of Japan's 0% interest rate policy. This low rate, in essence, allowed investors to borrow money for next to nothing and use it to, for example, buy stocks, bonds, or anything else in the global financial market. This has been a safe and profitable trade over the years, but that all changed last week after the Japanese central bank raised interest rates above 0% for the first time in 17 years. And earlier, I spoke to the senior analyst at FX Street, Joseph Trevisani, about how big the carry trade unraveling may be. How big do you think this unwinding will be?
Well, the unwinding has mostly taken place right now. It started when Japan intervened, the BOJ intervened in the dollar-yen around 162, and they drove it down. It's also been helped, of course, by the July 31st increase in the BOJ base rate to 0.15%. Before that, the Bank of Japan had held the base rate at negative 0.1% for 8 years. That's rather astonishing, and that, of course, contributed substantially to the yen weakness.
Do you know, in terms of a value here, how big the unwinding may be?
Well, it's hard to say how much is actually transacts in the currency markets when it comes to these kinds of moves. This has been primarily a currency move in the dollar yen. The weak yen imports inflation into Japan. It makes all foreign products, all imported products more expensive. It also makes oil, which Japan has none of, much more expensive, and that goes out through the entire economy. So the reason the BOJ did this, and of course the government behind it, was to help control inflation in Japan.
So why is this happening now, right? Because back in 2022, the yen appreciated 15% in 3 months, but back then we didn't see any talks of the carry trade causing problems in the stock market.
That's true. And this time in the stock market, I think it was a coincidence of a number of things. This time you had a very overbought equity sector, certainly in the United States, having to do with AI, having to do with the NASDAQ, and the type of speculative pricing that you saw in the equities. When you combine that with a tremendous loss in the Japanese Nikkei, that became a contagion around the world, more than any specific item, I think, having to do with the carry trade.
Who do you think has been caught up in this? Who's losing?
Well, the losers are anybody who's still long dollar yen. because dollar yen came off more than 10%. At peak, it was off 12% in almost a month. That's an astonishing move, even in the currency markets, which are used to relative volatility. So that, I think, is the reason. Much as you saw in the equities with the tremendous decline in the equities, it was people who were long equities, long technology, long the NASDAQ, if you will, and long dollar yen. They were long those positions for speculative trading purposes. Thus, they cut out very quickly, and the whole thing cascaded.
Do we know what kind of institutions are involved in the carry trade?
I would say that many of the speculative types of traders that are involved in all the markets, hedge funds and such, are the ones who participate in these types of trades. If you're on the right side of a trade like this, there's substantial profits, substantial trading profits. If you were shorting the NASDAQ as it went down, substantial trading profits. Same with the yen. If you shorted dollar yen around 162, 160, 157 on the way down, there are substantial profits involved in this. Those are the types of entities that are involved in these trades.
Can you explain to us exactly how are they borrowing and how are they levering it?
Certainly. The carry trade is really a very simple idea, and it's very logically accurate. If the borrowing rate in Japan is considerably lower, as it has been, excuse me, for many years, than it is in the United States or other places where you can invest, then you can borrow money in Japan at a very low rate in yen, sell the yen, which drives the dollar yen rate up, that means higher, weaker yen, and then take the money in the dollars that you get on the other side of that currency trade and invest it in the United States, invest it in Europe, invest it in equities, invest it in treasury bills and things like that. That's a very sensible trade, and it is logically supported by the difference in interest rates, and that's really what's behind it. I think that this type of trade, as long as these interest rate differentials exist, the trade exists. And that's the logic behind this. And it is certainly one of the financial reasons behind the tremendous decrease in the value of the yen recently.
All right, Joseph, thank you for your time today.
Thank you for having me. Always a pleasure.
Now, a volatile relationship between Elon Musk's X and advertisers has reached a new level. The social media giant has launched an antitrust lawsuit as the CEO calls an alleged coordinated boycott against X just wrong.
People are hurt when the marketplace of ideas is constricted. No small group of people should be able to monopolize what gets monetized.
So this is in response to a U.S. House Judiciary Committee report on GARM, which is the Global Alliance for Responsible Media. The report found evidence GARM tried to influence the content online by encouraging companies to pull advertising dollars. So GARM represents major brands responsible for 90% of global advertising spending. The lawsuit charges that this cost X billions of dollars. All right, taking a break now. Coming up, the federal government is committing over $2 billion in a bid to shore up the nation's power grid. It's also earmarked $500 million for one microchip company. And workers paint a picture of chaos and dysfunction at Boeing. They told federal safety investigators that they felt pressure to do their jobs too fast to avoid mistakes. That and more after the break. Welcome back. Today's top headlines. All three major U.S. indexes recovering today and ending in the green after a volatile red day yesterday. But top banks and analysts say there could be more pain to come. JP Morgan and UBS warning the unwinding of the popular yen carry trade is only 50% done. Uber shares pop as the company reports strong second quarter earnings. The total value of rides, deliveries, and freight up 21% year over year, now nearly $40 billion. More first-time Uber Eats than any time in the last year. And Vice President Kamala Harris chooses Minnesota Governor Tim Walz as her running mate. It comes the morning after Harris was officially nominated as the Democratic Party nominee in a virtual roll call. Walz began his career in the Army National Guard, serving for 24 years before becoming a high school teacher. The Biden administration is investing more than $2 billion to revamp the nation's power grid. The country's electric transmission system has been under pressure from extreme weather conditions and increased need from data centers. Meanwhile, the U.S. Commerce Department has awarded to the world's second largest memory chip maker up to $450 million. SK Hynix will use the funds to help an advanced packaging plant and artificial intelligence R&D in Indiana, and the U.S. is pushing semiconductor development. Tropical storm Debbie is disrupting the lives of thousands in Florida and Georgia. The storm system is expected to move off the coast before making another landfall. Over 150,000 customers are without power in Florida, Georgia, and South Carolina. More than a day after Debbie made landfall, the storm caused 1,800 flight cancellations nationwide yesterday and more than 300 today. And as well today, the National Transportation Safety Board began an investigative hearing into the January 5th Alaska Airlines flight. The Boeing plane's door came off mid-air. Here's more from witnesses and the NTSB today.
A long-awaited investigative hearing into Alaska Airlines Flight 1282 began with a stark promise from National Transportation Safety Board Chair Jennifer Homendy.
We will not leave until all questions are asked.
7 months ago, panic in the skies after the Boeing 737-9 MAX's door plug shot off, leaving a gaping hole in the side of the aircraft.
This was quite traumatic for the crew and the passengers, and injuries we can't see, which we often don't talk about, can have profound, lasting impacts on lives and livelihoods.
A preliminary investigation by the NTSB found the plane left a Boeing factory in October, missing 4 bolts needed to secure the door. In late June, Boeing said a lack of paperwork was to blame.
You're cutting corners. You are eliminating safety procedures. You are sticking it to your employees.
That same month, Boeing CEO Dave Calhoun faced harsh criticism from elected leaders and families of victims who died in Boeing 737 MAX 8 plane crashes during a heated subcommittee hearing.
I apologize for the grief that we have caused.
This week's hearing brings renewed scrutiny to the embattled aerospace company. Homendy accused them of using Tuesday's testimony for self-promotion.
This isn't a PR campaign for Boeing. This is an investigation on what happened on January 5th.
And that's all the stories we have for you today on Business Matters. Thank you very much for watching. If you have any feedback for the episode, please feel free to let me know. You can email us at business@ntd.com or leave a comment online. I do read them. And thanks again for watching. We'll see you back here tomorrow.